This is our class for Wednesday, um, and what I like to do is to talk about aspects of English grammar and use and how we can actually look at language from not only a grammatical perspective but also from a usage perspective, which is what we actually do when we use language. Um, we know that there are differences between what we call spoken language and written language. So as you can see, spoken language is synchronous, so obviously it takes place in real time. If you think of conversation or any other kind of spoken language, a lecture, speech, etc., etc. Written language, on the other hand, is asynchronous, so it's delayed. I send you a note, and then of course you read it, and then you answer back, or an email, or even a text message. Obviously, when we're looking at spoken language and written language, here we're talking about traditional forms of spoken language and written language. So perhaps digital communication will be out of the question here, because of course digital communication could be more or less asynchronous, and we have different modes and different forms of communication. So basically we're talking about written language, traditional written language, and traditional spoken language. So we were saying that spoken language involves immediate feedback or has immediate feedback. Written language has delayed feedback. As you can see, in terms of formality, we can have spoken language that is formal or informal, and written language that is formal or informal. So if you think of a presidential speech, which is spoken or that's been prepared, perhaps someone wrote down the speech and the president delivers the speech, so that's going to be more formal. But then if you think of casual conversation or a conversation between two friends, then of course that's going to be casual or informal. And for written language, again, a legal contract, an academic paper, both are going to be formal. A note you scribble to someone will be informal, or then again a text message, if we include digital writing, would be informal too. Now when we use spoken language, of course we use gestures, we use facial expressions, we use what we call paralanguage. So communication is achieved not only by sending out, if you like, words and phrases. We also need other props, other elements that we can use and utilize to get our meanings across. Written language, of course, does not use any of these gestures or facial expressions. We don't see, who's actually writing. We just read the final product, the end product, be that a book or a text or even an email. Spoken language is more transient, is done, said and gone. Written language is more permanent. We've got records of that. Now, of course, you could say, well, you can now record a conversation. Yes, of course you can. But then again, remember, we're talking about traditional forms of spoken language and traditional forms of written language. So recording will not be included here. Now, of course, you can capture that conversation on tape. And then spoken language is more or less improvised, and written language, again, traditional, formal, if you like, written language is less improvised. So these are some of the features of spoken language and written language. Now, if you think of written language and spoken language in terms of which came first, if you like, then of course we would all agree there was spoken language. So much so that some cultures, in some parts of the world, do not have a written form of their language, but they still can speak that language and communicate with one another. So if we look at the structure of language, we've got what we all know, and this, there's a semantic of any language, English in this particular case, that's meaning. There are grammatical components, we have parts of the sentence, verb, adjective, object, complement phrase, clause, and all the rest of it. And we've got types of words, we've got nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs. Each of these words will have a different function. But there are also outside the structure of any language, English in this case, social aspects of language social aspects, if you like, that have an impact on how we use language. And what are these social factors, as we can call them? Well, typically there are four, although you will see five on the slide. There's age, there's gender, there's socioeconomic level, and education is usually included there in socioeconomic level because it is assumed that the more money you have, the more resources you will have, and obviously you will have access to a better education than if you don't have any money. And then there's also ethnic background or ethnicity. So these are the big four macro social factors that have an impact on how we use language. So think, for example, how a 2-year-old uses English and how a 20-year-old uses English and how a 90-year-old uses English. Now, they use the same language and they can communicate with one another, of course, because at the end of the day, we're talking about the same language. But there are ways of using language which obviously which are different. The same for an educated speakers and a non-educated speakers. And we also find differences between men and women in how they use language. Then there's also the frequency of use, which is important in terms of use. Again, not the structure, but how we use language. If you think of terminate, for example, it's a word that comes from Latin, and it means end or finish. But however, the frequency of this particular word in English is very low and is very technical. So what can you terminate? Well, you can terminate a contract. Yes, you can terminate a pregnancy. So, as you can see, we're looking at a rather technical term. We're looking at a legal, medical term in some cases. You can also say that trains terminate at station. That's also possible in English. But if you think of the word in Spanish, of course, terminate, whatever the translation is, that of course has a wider range of meaning and is not restricted to any particular use. The same for sentiments. So we do have this word that comes from Latin. In English we have feelings. So what's the difference between feelings and sentiments? Well, of course, one is more technical and therefore the frequency of use is very low, and that's sentiments. Of course, most of the times we use feelings. We say I don't want to hurt your feelings. We don't usually say I don't want to hurt your sentiments. The meaning is there, but it's not just a question of meaning. All right. Then again, if you think of enter and necessity, again, these words are there in the English language. Are they used? Well, of course they're used, but how frequently are they used? Well, not very frequently. We usually prefer other words like, we would normally say she went into the room rather than she entered the room. Both are possible, of course. Or, we talk of needs rather than necessities. Right? And of course, because words change their meaning throughout time, if you think of the word wireless, and if you look it up in your dictionary, you will find, perhaps to your surprise, that in the past, wireless meant radio. Now, of course, to you and to me, wireless means something else. So we're talking about a wireless connection, presumably, whenever we think of the word wireless. But we do not certainly think of a radio. So that word is there in the dictionary, but we do not use it. So the frequency of use is nil, 0. Or oculist, for example, if you look it up in your English dictionary, you will find that oculist is a doctor that treats your eyes. But it's certainly not a word that we actually use. We go for eye doctor, ophthalmologist, perhaps other forms, but certainly not oculist. Or if you think of the word intercourse, again, the dictionary will tell us that intercourse means a dialogue. And if you ever read Jane Austen, you will find that Jane Austen used intercourse in her books to mean a dialogue, a conversation. However, to us, an intercourse can only be a sexual encounter. And that's the reason why we do not use this word as frequently as perhaps Jane Austen did to mean dialogue, because we use dialogue, intercourse, even if we don't have the word sexual next to it, that's what we understand, right? So again, words change their meaning through time, and we cannot really use words just because they mean or meant something. So the frequency of use is crucial when we use any language, not just English. So when we're talking about the structure and use, we are obviously torn apart, between two camps, if you like, and there are lots of questions that we can ask ourselves. What is good language? For whom, when, and where? So all these questions that we have. I mean, is it, educated language? What do we mean by educated language? What is it? Is swearing good language, or is it bad language? Well, morally, we would say that swearing is really bad language. However, in some situations, swearing is just what we need. So it's not a question of being correct or incorrect, and that brings us to another point: correctness versus appropriacy. You see, so most of the time when we're talking about use and how we use language, we're looking at how appropriate is this word or this phrase in this particular context, not in the vacuum. You see, whether it's correct or incorrect, it's a bit dodgy because we don't really know what is correct or incorrect, and we're not talking about grammar correction here. You see, we're looking at a broader issue. But then language changes, as we say. Well, we change, and remember, language does not change, on its own. We change it. We speakers change it, and we innovate in language. So there's the norm on the one hand, and there's language innovation and change, and there seems to be a conflict sometimes. There is a clash between the norm, we hang on to, and how language changes, and also this tension, if you like, between prescription, what we should do and should say in terms of language, and the social consensus and evaluation that somehow there is in a particular community among users of a particular language or variety of the language, in terms, again, of what is appropriate or inappropriate. All right. So what are the problems that this poses for translators and interpreters? Well, again, sometimes you need to apply, or most of the times you need to apply the norm if you're translating a text. However, that norm will have to obviously take into account, what speakers wanted to do, all right, and wanted to mean by what they mean. So this is crucial. I would like you to think of, these sentences, two sets of sentences, if you like, and to think about what is wrong with these sentences. Now, you will notice that on the first slide we have one type of sentences, and the second slide there's another set of sentences which are different. And I would like you to do that as a task and reflect. What is wrong with these sentences? Batch number 1 and then batch number 2. So you've got the two slides here. And then if you click on this image, of course there's a video for you, which is about what we call a grammar Nazi. You see, what is a grammar Nazi? Perhaps people who get very angry when someone uses, ungrammatical sentences, or perhaps, words that are considered not correct. All right. So watch the video and think of the errors that are mentioned here, and why do we call these people, speakers again, grammar Nazis? What do we mean by that? What do you think? All right. So what I'd like you to do, if you can send me your comments as part of your task, as a task if you like, about the sentences above, on the other slides. Why are they wrong? We have two sets of sentences, and what is a grammar Nazi? Should translators, should linguists, professional translators or interpreters be grammar Nazis? What do you think? And then we'll carry on later on, and we move on to context. We say that language, if you like, is made up of two very big parts. There is the structure of the language, there's the structure of English, and there is use, but obviously use means context, because we use language in one particular context. When we are buying a drink, when we're talking to friends, when we are delivering a speech, when we are buying a ticket at the station, etc., etc. So there are concrete situations where we use language. So have a look at the questions again, or sentences that I put together for you. So why are they wrong? What do you think? And what does a grammar nut say? Should we be grammar Nazis? So I'll leave you to it, and I would like you to upload your comments and questions on Classroom. Well, okay, well, so I'll see you in a bit then.